riverboat captains, gunslingers, gamblers, farmers, and everyday travelers plied the Alabama River during its heyday of river transportation in the 1800s and into the early 1900s. At one point in the 1800s, there were more people living along the Alabama River than lives along its banks today. And as land becomes scarcer and farming and timber cutting become more prominent, people moved into the interior and founded little communities like Narrow Gap, places that are now all but forgotten to the pages of time, researchers, and old cemeteries. It's places like this where you can find stories that still relate and resonate to us today in our modern era from that time that's not so far in the past as one might believe, but in a lot of instances, it's a period of time when our grandfathers' grandfathers lived. So today we're going to take a look at one of those long forgotten communities and see what kind of tales from the past that we can benefit from learning from them. So just sit down, get you a good drink or something to eat, and watch these tales from Narrow Gap. And then we're going to talk about a lawman that came from the area and some of the pursuits he made in the early 1900s. Hello everybody, welcome to another edition of Southern Shadows and Dust. We're going to the forgotten community of Narrow Gap today to talk about a little cemetery and some of the residents that lived there in the past. So hop in and hang on. Narrow Gap was a community which prospered in Monroe County between Eureka Landing and Uriah in the early part of the 20th century. Today, little is left or known of the forgotten community except a grassy cemetery in the windswept edges of a farmer's field and a few random ghost stories which haunt the night. The thing about communities called Narrow Gap, there always seems to be a small little creek crossing. It's just maybe a coincidence, but over in Escambia County, close to the grave of George Washington Emmons, that area was said to be Narrow Gap. So we're about to cross a little creek down here that takes us on to our destination. Everything's so dry right now that there's not much water in that creek. It's more like a stream. Bullet riddled street sign. Back in the olden days in Monroe County, it was necessary that if you lived on a road, you had to contribute either labor to maintain the road, or you had to contribute farm animals to do so, such as mules and plows and such as that. Today we're going to learn about a situation where that turned deadly. Let's see where all we're headed to up here. You can tell this is a really old part of the county. It doesn't have a lot of people living there. There's a remnants of an old homestead. Infrastructure and cattle on the left. And our destination's right up here upon us. Lee Peacock, in one of his pieces talks about this cemetery at Narrow Gap and the forgotten community that was here. There's not a lot left here today, but you can see remnants of past grandeur and where people lived, and there's supposedly an old homestead in that grove of trees. A good friend of mine, John Reed, has a grandfather buried here, which we'll look at his headstone. He was a Creek Indian, and he was a Confederate veteran by the name of Randolph Reed. And he was in Company A of the 21st Regiment of Alabama Infantry. John Reed had told me that near the end of the war he was captured, and he was designated to carry a Union sergeant, I believe it was, that was wounded. And that when they got to a point where he could throw the man down, he threw him down and made his escape back to Confederate lines. And that his real name was Dolph Reed, but because he ran, they called him Randolph Reed. So I thought that was an interesting story that adds a lot of color to the story of the man himself. You know, so there's other people that were related to him that's buried here. This is a Delilah Reed, and some of these headstones are starting to fade a little bit with time. This is two children, Wesley Freeman and Leslie Freeman. Wesley was born September 21st, 1913, died September 26, 1913. Leslie Freeman, born September 21st, 1913, and died October 22nd, 1913. So they were twins and died as infants. You can see the cotton farming in this area, and the agriculture, cattle that we looked at just a minute ago. It's a beautiful place in the country north of Uriah, Alabama, kind of northwest of Uriah, and between Uriah and Eureka Landing. James N. Lufton, born August 14th, 1840, died May 4th, 1907. And we can also tell in this cemetery that there are other graves that are marked with simple little steel markers, and you can see the remnants of the headstones there. Story goes in this little area that sometimes orbs can be seen floating at night, and that there is a woman in a carriage that waits for her Confederate veteran husband to return from the war, and he never returns, and so she continues to wait. As I had mentioned a little while ago, maintaining the roads in Monroe County was a lot different 100 years ago in the 1920s than it is today. Today there's road crews and county commissioners, and I guess they had county commissioners back in those days too. But if you lived on a road, like I had said earlier, you were required to help participate in maintaining it. In this area, a good friend of Randolph Reed was Steele that lived here, and he was supervising the work on this, presumably on this road, in February of 1922. And a Mr. Hall that was under his supervision, Steele did not care for Hall's work ethic, I guess it might be said, and said something to him about it. And the Hall fella said, "Well, let's see you make me work any harder," or something to that effect. And so Hall drew his gun, and Steele supposedly had a gun under his raincoat. It had been raining that day and it was muddy. And Hall shot Steele, and Steele fell onto the road, and a weapon slid out of his raincoat. There was a trial, and Hall was convicted. Stephen Steele had a brother that was also raised in the area, known as Lumen or Norman Steele, depending on which newspaper you're looking at. But the Atmore Record and the local newspapers in Escambia County and even in Monroe County somewhat mention him a good bit. He took the reins of law enforcement in Atmore and became the town marshal at a time when there was a good deal of mischief, misdemeanoring, and other lawlessness that was passing over the city like a plague of locusts. During the hot summer of 1921, it seemed trouble was easy to be found in the Atmore area. According to the August 4th edition of the Atmore Record, the paper reported that as Robert Daly lay sleeping on a Friday night, his wife, Berta Daly, threw a cup full of hot lye in the sleeping man's face. The man's shrill cries for help drew his neighbors on the north side of Atmore to his house. The doctor was summoned at once and thought he saved at least one of his eyes, and soon Marshal Steele was on the task of trying to catch the wayward wife. Steele also was involved in breaking up a counterfeiting ring in the first 3 months of 1914. After working on a case of counterfeiting for the past 3 months, Marshal Steele was about to effect the arrest of a Mr. Houseman, who has lived on the Robinson Place 7 miles from Atmore since January. The arrest was made Friday night by a special United States Marshal. And there was also a story of Steele going with a sheriff from Baldwin County to arrest a man at a place called the Head of Perdido. And when the man wouldn't surrender and came out of the house with his guns blazing, Steele and the sheriff and deputies from Baldwin County had to cut him down. And there's other stories when they were in the area looking for AWOL soldiers in World War I. There was one that a Boone fellow that they tracked. Steele believed he was staying at a place known as Horseneck near Scranage, and they came out looking for him, but he wasn't there. But he ended up being close to Eureka, staying in a home of a friend of his by the last name of Hales. They had a shootout there, and Marshal Steele shot the man in the leg with a double-barrel shotgun, thereby breaking his leg, and that's how they apprehended him. And stories go on in the Atmore papers of that era about Marshal Steele and how he was cleaning up the area. And today it's easy to imagine a lawman in the early 20th century riding on the running board of an old Model A or Model T, chasing bad guys down the dusty roads of our past. I hope you've enjoyed this installment of Southern Shadows and Dust. Please